July 17th, 2018. Huntsville, Texas. A man lies strapped to a gurney inside the wall's unit execution chamber. His arms are extended at his sides, not folded, not crossed, stretched out almost like a cross. Needles already in his veins. Witnesses behind the glass. A clock on the wall ticking toward a number that cannot be undone. His name is Christopher Young, and the state of Texas has decided that today is the last day of his life. He doesn't look like a monster. That's the thing nobody tells you. He looks like somebody's father. Because he is. 3 daughters. 3 little girls who wrote letters begging for his life. Letters that went unanswered. The warden asks if he has any final words. He does. He speaks of love. He speaks of legacy. He speaks of children, not just his own, but every at-risk kid he spent 14 years trying to reach from behind prison walls. And then he says 7 words. 7 words so heavy they stop people mid-scroll when they hit the internet. Make sure the kids keep this fight going. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I didn't do it. Not a plea for sympathy or a last-minute profession of innocence. 7 words about the future. About children. About a fight he wouldn't live to finish. Moments later, he said something else. Something quieter. Something that sent chills through everyone in that room. I tasted in my throat. And then, silence. Pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. Now, before we go any further, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city, your country, your state in the comments. Whether you're tuned in from the U.S., the UK, Canada, Australia, or somewhere across the world, I want to know who's in this room with me tonight. Because this story deserves witnesses. Real ones. But to understand why those 7 words broke the internet, we have to go back 37 years. San Antonio, Texas, 1981. A baby boy is born. His mother holds him. His father is there. For a moment, just a moment, the world is full of possibility. His name is Christopher Anthony Young. And if you had seen him at 5 years old, you would have never, not in a million years, predicted that gurney. Here's what people don't talk about when they tell Christopher Young's story. They skip straight to the crime. They skip straight to the courtroom. They skip straight to death row. But if you skip the beginning, you miss the whole point. Because Christopher Young wasn't born dangerous. He was built that way. Brick by brick. Loss by loss. By the time Christopher was in elementary school, 2 things were already clear about him. First, the boy was sharp. Gifted, even. He played chess with a focus that surprised adults twice his age. He picked up the violin, then the cello, then the bass. Music came naturally to him. The kind of natural that doesn't just happen. The kind that suggests something bigger was possible, if only the conditions had been right. But conditions matter. Enormously. And Christopher's conditions were quietly catastrophic. He was 8 years old when his father was murdered. 8! Think about what 8 years old looks like. Loose teeth. Saturday morning cartoons. A kid who still believes his dad is the strongest man in the world. And then, gone. Violently. A robbery. A senseless, random act of street violence that didn't just take a father. It took the foundation, the protection, the blueprint for what a man was supposed to look like. Christopher never recovered from that loss. How could he? Nobody helped him process it. Nobody sat with him in that grief and showed him what to do with it. The world just kept moving and left a broken 8-year-old behind. And home offered no refuge. His stepfather, the man who was supposed to fill that void, was predatory, abusive. He molested and impregnated Christopher's own sister inside the walls of that house. His mother, drowning in poverty and her own pain, couldn't hold things together, couldn't provide the structure, the safety, the stability that a boy like Christopher desperately needed. So he went looking for it elsewhere. The Bloods found him before anyone else did. And honestly, can you blame him? The gang offered exactly what his home couldn't. Brotherhood, protection, a place to belong. A set of people who said, "We've got you," and actually meant it. For a boy whose father had been ripped away and whose home had become a place of shadows, that offer was impossible to refuse. The violin was set down. The chessboard was pushed aside. And Christopher Young, gifted, sharp, full of potential, began a slow walk toward the streets. By 21, he was a father himself. 3 daughters, 3 little girls who called him daddy. And he loved them. That part was real. But he was also deep in crack cocaine, deep in alcohol, deep in a version of himself that the streets had spent years carefully constructing. The boy who could have been something extraordinary was disappearing. And nobody intervened. Before we go any further, a gifted child, a murdered father, a home full of shadows, and a system that looked at all of that and did nothing. If that makes you angry, if you believe that 8-year-old boy deserved better than the path the world handed him, hit subscribe right now, because the people who want stories like this buried, they're not subscribing, they're not sharing, they're not here, but you are. November 21st, 2004, a Sunday morning in San Antonio. Most people are sleeping in. Some are heading to church. Kids are watching cartoons. The world is doing what the world does on a quiet Sunday, moving slowly, unbothered, ordinary. Christopher Young is already unraveling. By mid-morning, he has consumed nearly 20 beers. 20. Not sipping, consuming. And layered on top of that alcohol, crack cocaine. The combination is doing what that combination always does. Stripping away inhibition, distorting reality, turning a man into something he can barely control. This is not an excuse. Understand that clearly, but it is context, because what happens next isn't calculated. It isn't the work of a criminal mastermind sitting in a dark room planning his moves. It is chaos. It is a man in chemical freefall, making decisions that will destroy multiple lives, including his own, in the space of a single morning. The first victim was a woman in her apartment. Christopher forced his way in. Inside that apartment were her 3 young children, watching, present, witnesses to something no child should ever see. He sexually assaulted her at gunpoint. Then he forced her into a red Mazda Protege and drove away. She managed to escape a block later. She jumped out. She ran. Christopher kept the car, armed, intoxicated, alone now in a stolen vehicle. A man spinning completely out of control with no one to stop him and nowhere to land. Roughly an hour later, he pulled into the parking lot of the mini food mart. And this is where the story becomes something else entirely. Because Christopher Young knew the store. He knew the man inside. Hasmukhpatel, everyone in the neighborhood called him Hash, was not a stranger. They were acquaintances, familiar faces to each other. The kind of relationship built on small transactions and neighborly nods over years of proximity. Christopher walked in anyway. He demanded money. What happened next lasted only seconds, but those seconds changed everything. During the struggle, Christopher fired his handgun. The bullet struck Hasmukhpatel in the hand, ricocheted, and entered his chest. Surveillance cameras captured the entire encounter. That footage is chilling, not because it shows a monster, but because it shows the opposite. It shows a frantic, disorganized, panicked man. No calm, no precision, no ice in his veins, just chaos wearing a human face, making an irreversible decision in a moment of drug-fueled desperation. Christopher fled with a small amount of cash. Hasmukhpatel collapsed on the floor of his own store. He died there, alone, in the business he had built, in the community he had served. Gone, because a man in chemical freefall walked through his door on a Sunday morning. Christopher's getaway lasted exactly 90 minutes. He picked up a woman, drove to a known drug house across town, didn't change clothes, didn't ditch the weapon, didn't run far enough or fast enough or smart enough, because this was never the work of someone thinking clearly. San Antonio police spotted the stolen red Mazda outside the drug house. They moved in. Christopher surrendered without resistance. The murder weapon was still on him. 90 minutes. That's all the freedom that morning bought him. 90 minutes. And a lifetime of consequences for everyone involved. Stop. Before we go any further, we need to talk about Hasmukhpatel, because in stories like this, victims have a way of becoming footnotes. A name in a court file, a face in a news report, a tragedy that exists only to explain what comes next. Hasmukhpatel was not a footnote. He came from India with a dream that millions of immigrants carry across oceans. The belief that hard work in the right country could build something real, something lasting, something worth passing down. He built that something in San Antonio, Texas. The mini food mart wasn't just a store. It was a statement, a declaration that said, I came here with nothing, and I created something. Every early morning opening, every late night closing, every transaction across that counter was proof that the dream had worked. The neighborhood knew him, loved him. Hash was the kind of man who remembered your name, asked about your kids, gave credit when times were tight. The kind of presence that makes a community feel like a community, rather than just a collection of strangers living near each other. He was 55 years old. He had a son. That son's name was Mitesh. And on November 21st, 2004, Miteshpatel's world cracked open in a way that never fully heals. The call that no child, no matter their age, is ever ready to receive. Your father is gone. Hasmukhpatel didn't die in a war. He didn't die of illness after a long life fully lived. He died on the floor of his own store, in the community he had served for years, because he was in the wrong place when a man in chemical freefall walked through his door. He deserved a long life. He deserved to watch Mitesh grow old. He deserved better than a Sunday morning in November. Remember his name. 2006, San Antonio, Texas. 2 years after that Sunday morning, Christopher Young sat in a courtroom facing the full weight of the American legal system. And the prosecution came prepared. The surveillance footage from the mini food mart. 2 eyewitnesses who watched him flee the parking lot. DNA evidence linking him directly to the sexual assault earlier that morning. The murder weapon recovered from his person at the time of arrest. There was no reasonable doubt to manufacture. No cracks in the case to exploit. The evidence wasn't just strong, it was suffocating. Christopher Young had committed capital murder. The jury knew it within hours. But the conviction was only half the battle. In Texas, a death sentence doesn't come automatically with a guilty verdict. The jury must answer a specific question, one of the most consequential questions in American law. Will this person be a future danger to society? That's the standard. Future dangerousness. And it essentially asks 12 people to look at a human being and predict, with lethal certainty, who they will be for the rest of their life. The prosecution answered that question before the jury could even ask it. They laid out Christopher's gang affiliation with the Bloods. They presented the carjacking. They detailed the sexual assault. They painted a portrait of a man who had spent his entire adult life moving toward violence, and argued convincingly that nothing would ever change that trajectory. Here is the part that should make you pause. The defense presented Christopher's childhood as mitigation. The murdered father, the abusive stepfather, the poverty, the neglect, the gang that filled the void where family should have been. They laid out every broken piece of his origin story and asked the jury to weigh it, to consider that the man before them had been shaped by forces far beyond his control. The prosecution took that same childhood, every wound, every loss, every scar, and reframed it, not as context, not as mitigation, as evidence, as proof that Christopher Young had been dangerous his entire life, and would remain dangerous until his last breath. A broken childhood, used not to explain a man, but to condemn him. The jury deliberated. They answered yes to future dangerousness. And with that single word, yes, Christopher Young was sentenced to death. He was 25 years old. The gavel came down. The decision was final. And somewhere in that courtroom, a man who had spent his whole life being failed by systems was failed by one more. Here is something the headlines never told you. If Christopher Young had been executed in 2006, the year he was sentenced, the story would have ended there. A violent man, a senseless crime, another name added to a long list. But he wasn't executed in 2006. He spent 14 years on death row. And in those 14 years, something happened that nobody predicted. Something that doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of monsters and victims that true crime loves to sell. Christopher Young changed. It started quietly, the way real transformation always does. Not with dramatic announcement, but with small, deliberate choices made in the silence of a concrete cell. He renounced the Bloods. Officially, completely. The gang that had been his family since childhood. The brotherhood that had filled the void his murdered father left behind. He walked away from it. On death row. With nothing to gain and everything to lose socially within those walls. He turned to religion. To art. He became a prolific painter. Canvas after canvas filled with imagery that spoke of a man wrestling with his own soul, trying to make something beautiful in the ugliest possible circumstances. But it wasn't the paintings that made people stop and pay attention. It was what he did for other people. There's a documented account of Christopher stepping between an inmate and a correctional officer during a confrontation that was escalating fast. He didn't have to intervene. Nobody on death row intervenes. There's no reward, no reduced sentence, no incentive whatsoever. He did it because it was right. The assault was prevented. Then there was the inmate who had decided he was done living, who had reached the edge of whatever edge exists inside a place like Polunsky and was ready to step off it. Christopher talked him back, sat with him in that darkness, and refused to let him disappear into it. A man sentenced to death, saving a life. And then there were the letters. Christopher began corresponding with at-risk youth across Texas. Young men standing at the same crossroads he once stood at, the gang on one side, an uncertain future on the other. His message was never preachy, never rehearsed. It was just honest. Look at where I am. Don't end up like me. 6 words. More powerful than any after-school program, any motivational speaker, or any government initiative. Those letters found their way to documentary filmmakers. The filmmakers found their way to social media. And suddenly, the world outside those walls began paying attention to a man inside them. People who had never heard of Christopher Young were watching footage of him, listening to him speak, writing about him, debating him. A man on death row, becoming a voice that reached further than most free men ever manage. His 3 daughters kept visiting. Letters through glass. Love across impossible distance. He was obsessed with one thing above everything else, making sure they didn't repeat his story. The monster of the prosecution, described in 2006, he was becoming something else entirely. And one person noticed more than anyone. Now we arrive at the part of this story that stopped me cold the first time I read it. The part that doesn't happen in true crime. The part that shouldn't be possible. And yet, somehow, was Miteshpatel, the son of the man Christopher Young killed. The boy who grew up without a father because of the man sitting on death row. He didn't want Christopher executed. Let that land for a moment. After his father's murder, Mitesh carried the grief the way children of violent loss always do. Quietly, heavily, with no clean place to put it. There's no manual for losing a parent to homicide. No roadmap for the anger, the confusion, the endless loop of why that never fully resolves. But Mitesh was also paying attention. He watched the documentaries. He saw the footage of Christopher on death row, the paintings, the letters, the interventions, the man who had become something the prosecution never accounted for. And something shifted in him. Not forgiveness, not immediately, but curiosity. The dangerous, courageous kind of curiosity that asks what if the story is more complicated than I was told. He requested a meeting. When Miteshpatel sat across from Christopher Young for the first time, separated by glass, connected by grief, he saw something he wasn't expecting. He saw himself. 2 men, both sons, both fatherless. One who lost his father to street violence at 8 years old. One who lost his father to the consequences of that same violence 14 years later. Different sides of the same devastating equation. I really do believe Chris Young today is not the person he was 14 years ago, Mitesh said publicly. Executing him wouldn't bring my father back. It would just leave more daughters without a father. Read that again slowly. A son, choosing empathy over vengeance. Choosing the future over the past. Choosing to honor his father's memory not with more blood, but with a kind of grace that Hasmukhpatel, a quiet, community-minded man of peace, would likely have recognized. Mitesh went further than words. He petitioned the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles directly. He stood before the same system that had sentenced Christopher and argued, on the record, with his father's name attached, that executing this man served no purpose that justice actually required. He said his father was a man of peace, that more bloodshed in Hasmukh's name would have broken his heart. The day before the execution, July 16, 2018, Mitesh went back. One final visit, face to face through that glass partition, knowing that tomorrow the state would do what it had decided to do regardless of what either of them wanted. What passed between them in that room stays largely private. But those who knew both men described it as a moment of reconciliation so rare, so profoundly human, that it belongs in a category almost beyond language. Two sons without fathers, finding something like peace in the most impossible of places. Miteshpatel did not save Christopher Young's life, but he did something perhaps more powerful. He refused to let hatred be his father's legacy. Now, pay close attention to this part, because this is where the story stops being just about Christopher Young and starts being about something much larger. Something that should make every single person watching this deeply, quietly uncomfortable. Let me introduce you to Thomas Bart Whitaker. Bart Whitaker was born into privilege in Sugar Land, Texas. Private schools, comfortable home, a father who loved him unconditionally, a man named Kent Whitaker who, by every account, was a devoted, decent human being. In 2003, Bart Whitaker hired a hitman to murder his entire family. Not in a moment of chemical psychosis, not in a drug-fueled spiral of desperation and poor decisions. He planned it, deliberately, carefully. He orchestrated the assassination of his own mother, his own brother, and his own father, who survived the attack by chance alone. His mother and brother did not survive. Bart Whitaker was convicted of capital murder in 2007 and sentenced to death. In 2018, the same year Christopher Young was scheduled to die, Bart Whitaker's case went before the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles for clemency consideration. His surviving father, Kent Whitaker, the man Bart had tried to have killed, pleaded for his son's life to be spared. The board granted clemency. Governor Greg Abbott commuted Bart Whitaker's sentence to life in prison. Now, hold that in your mind. Hold it very carefully. Months later, Christopher Young's clemency petition came before the exact same board. Miteshpatel, the son of the man Christopher killed, had pleaded publicly, passionately, and on the record for Christopher's life to be spared. He had signed petitions, given interviews, stood before the system with his father's name and his own grief, and said, "This is not what justice looks like." The board voted 6-0. Denied. No commutation. No mercy. No acknowledgement that the victim's own family had asked, begged, for a different outcome. Christopher's legal team filed a federal lawsuit immediately, alleging racial discrimination. They pointed to a pattern that stretched across the entire 21st century. In cases where victims' families had appeared before the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles asking for mercy, clemency had been granted exactly once. That one case involved a white defendant. The courts ruled there wasn't enough time to stay the execution and properly litigate the claim. Let that sink in. Not enough time to investigate whether race determined who lives and who dies in the state of Texas. Bart Whitaker hired a hitman to kill his family. He is alive today. Christopher Young, whose own victim's son begged for his life, was executed. Same state, same year, same board, different outcomes. You tell me what changed. July 17th, 2018, the last day. There is no dramatic music for mornings like this one. No cinematic build, just the ordinary sound of prison waking up. Distant footsteps, metal doors, the mundane machinery of institutional life continuing exactly as it always does. Except for one man. For Christopher Young, nothing about this morning is ordinary. At 7:55 a.m., his final visitation began. His daughters, his family, the people who had written letters, made calls, fought in every way they knew how to stop what was coming. Now sitting across from him, not a fight anymore, but simply to be present, to give him the gift of familiar faces on the last morning he would ever see. What do you say to someone you love on their last day alive? What words are big enough for that room? There are none. So you just stay, you just show up, and you let your presence say What language cannot? At 9:15 a.m., Christopher met with a minister. He had spent 14 years building a relationship with faith, not the performative kind that death row sometimes produces, but something that appeared, by every account, to be genuine. A man making peace, not with the system, not with a verdict, but with himself, with God, with the weight of what his hands had done on a November morning 14 years earlier. Then came the last meal. In 2011, Texas abolished the practice of honoring special last meal requests. The decision came after a death row inmate ordered an elaborate feast and then refused to eat it. The state decided that was the end of the tradition. So on the last day of his life, Christopher Young ate whatever the Polunsky unit was serving that day to every other inmate. The same tray, the same portions. No ceremony, no acknowledgement that this meal was different from any other. That quiet detail is its own kind of tragedy. The state couldn't even grant him the dignity of a chosen meal. As the afternoon faded into evening, the transfers began. The procedural, unhurried movement of a man from one room toward another, each step measured, each door closing behind him with a finality that required no announcement. The execution chamber at the Walls unit is small, clinical, built for efficiency, not meaning. Witnesses took their places behind the glass. Christopher was strapped to the gurney, arms extended, needles placed. The room fell into the specific silence that only exists in places where something irreversible is about to happen. The clock read 6:21 p.m. The warden asked if he had any final words. He did. He spoke of Patel family first. I want to make sure the Patel family knows I love them like they love me. The family of the man he killed, the son who had fought to save his life. He wanted them to know, in his final breath, that their grace had not been lost on him, that Mitesh's extraordinary act of forgiveness had reached him completely. Then he spoke of the children, the at-risk youth he had been writing to for years, the young men standing at crossroads he recognized from his own story, the daughters he was leaving behind. Every child he had ever tried to pull back from the edge he had fallen off. And then 7 words. Make sure the kids keep this fight going. Not, save me. Not, this is unjust. Not, I am afraid. Make sure the kids keep this fight going. Think about what it takes to say that. To be strapped to a gurney with needles in your veins, seconds from death, and have your final conscious thought be about someone else's future. About children you will never see grow up, about a fight you are passing forward, because you cannot carry it any further yourself. That is not the statement of a monster. That is the statement of a man who had traveled, through the wreckage of his own making, all the way to something that looked undeniably like love. The lethal dose of pentobarbital began flowing. And then, quietly almost to himself, Christopher Young said his last words on this earth. I tasted it in my throat. He was pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. Christopher Young died at 6:38 p.m. on July 17, 2018. But his story didn't. His former high school principal made a promise in the days following the execution that the mentorship work Christopher had been doing through letters and glass partition conversations would not die with him, that the pipeline he had been building between the death row cell and the at-risk youth of San Antonio would continue, expanded, formalized, carried forward by people with the freedom to do what Christopher never could: restorative justice, community intervention, reaching children before the streets do. Miteshpatel didn't go quiet after the execution either. He became a public voice for restorative justice reform, speaking at events, giving interviews, pushing for a system that actually listens to victims' families instead of using them as props when convenient and ignoring them when inconvenient. He still carries his father's name into every room he enters, and across activist circles, in courtrooms, in conversations about racial disparity in the Texas Clemency process. 7 words became a rallying cry. Make sure the kids keep this fight going. Printed on shirts, shared in speeches, tattooed on skin. 7 words spoken from a gurney, traveling further than Christopher Young ever could. If this story made you feel something the news never bothered to tell you, if it made you question something, challenge something, see something differently, then this channel exists for you. Subscribe, because the next story we untangle might be the one that changes how you see the world. And if you'd rather the truth stayed buried, well, you know where the exit is. Share this video for Hasmukh. Share it for Christopher's daughters. Share it for every kid who needed someone to intervene, and nobody came. Keep fighting.